and welcome to another episode of In Session, Bennington to Montpelier. I am your host, Jack Rossiter-Munley, coming to you from the beautiful Bennington County Multicultural Community Center here in downtown Bennington, and I am thrilled to be joined by a wonderful cadre of legislators, starting with Senator Rob Plunkett, who's a returning guest. You might remember him from last week. We also have Representative Corcoran with us, who was with us right at the very beginning of the show, and three first-timers rounding out the rest of the delegation. I believe everybody from the Bennington delegation will now have been a guest, and I'm so happy to be joined by Representative Mary Morrissey, Representative David Durfee, and Representative Jonathan Cooper. Welcome everybody to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Jack.
For our first-time guests, I'm going to toss you the first-time guest questions, starting with Representative Morrissey. What district do you serve, and give us a general idea of the boundaries of that district?
Okay. Originally, when I was first elected, it was called Bennington District 2. Since the reapportionment 2 years ago in the legislature that is mandated to redraw the district lines every 10 years, it's called Bennington District 5. And the lines pretty much go up to this line of where the hospital is, the side of Dewey Street that the hospital is on is Tim Corcoran's district. And my district starts on the other side of Dewey Street and pretty much goes over to the Woodford line. It also encompasses a great deal of downtown kind of Bennington. So from like North Street, and actually after it was reapportioned, goes up to School Street. So one side of School Street is my district, the other side is not. It's kind of but along different streets there, but it also goes over to County Street up from the School Street district, but it also so it covers that whole area from that I kind of have defined, and then we also gained a section of Pownell, the northern piece of Pownell, which is on the eastern side of Route 7. There's a small chunk of property and constituents that's in that area that goes over to like South Stream Road and that area. Sorry if I got too detailed, but it's a great district.
No, I think that's great. And I think it's really helpful to remind people of what the district boundaries are, just because knowing what district you're in and who to vote for is always very important. I'm sure we'll hear a little more about that when we get to Representative Cooper. But if you could also let us know a little bit about your personal and professional background and what led you to take on this kind of public service through serving in the legislature.
Well, what I had done as a profession was marketing and consulting for most of my career life. I am pretty much retired from that. Out of this group, I'm probably one of the older members. I'm in my 60s, not that that matters, but I did marketing and consulting, and I was a buyer that went to New York City often over the years and through my career. And I am a native Benningtonian and Vermonter. I'm proud of that. And I've been very involved within our community, serving on numerous boards and volunteering a considerable amount of time over the years to be a part of my community. And I think that's always important, to give back what you can to your community, to help it in any way that you can. So I actually probably I may be the odd person out in saying this, but I never anticipated being asked or necessarily serving in the legislature. I was asked by numerous people if I would consider it, and I didn't ever really feel like, gee, am I qualified to do this job? And several of the people who I had very high regards for, and that they had the experience, had said, based upon my career, my experience, my involvement in the community, that yes, I did. And long story short, I got into the election cycle actually late in the process in 1996. There was another candidate that dropped out of the race in September. So my first run for office was late in the process, and at the end of the day, in November of 1996, I was elected to my first term in the legislature, and I have continued since. This is my 29th year in the Vermont House of Representatives.
That's wonderful. And hopping over to one of our newest members of the delegation, Representative Cooper, same questions for you. Can you let people know the general bounds of your district, the area that you serve, and then also the personal and professional background that has led you to this kind of public service?
Certainly, I'd be glad to, Jack. And thank you for having me on today. I'm glad to be able to join. So the Bennington 1 district is 4 towns and a portion of a fifth. So we begin sort of in Woodford, head up the hill to Searsburg, down the hill into Reedsboro, then back over to Stamford, and rounding out the journey with the portion of Pownell that is not within the Bennington 5 district. That makes up the bulk of the town. And yes, that boundary is an important one along Barber Pond Road, and then sort of the northeastern corner of the town that's part of Bennington 5 now, with Mike and Mary. My background is I've been since 2016 the regional planner with the Bennington County Regional Commission, managing their community and economic development program. And I do think that working at a regional planning commission is a pretty good prep for public service. There's a lot of community meetings. My work specifically has been about working directly with the business community and with municipalities that have an interest in advancing their own sort of community and economic development goals, which is a good thing for all of our towns to be doing. And the BCRC is really a proud partner in a lot of those conversations from the North Shire, South Shire, and everywhere in between. And it gives you an opportunity for my work was really about trying to bring more resources to bear in our business communities that the state has available to it, to engage with businesses that wanted to put pieces in place for growth, whether it's in their marketing materials, whether it's in longer term strategic planning, shorter term grants for renovations and fit up. And that gives us an opportunity through workforce development to try to build out a pipeline that's on everyone's minds now, but it has been on the minds of employers through our region, certainly since I've been in the area, going back to 2016, and I'm sure for a lot longer before that. Fortunately for me, I sit on the House Committee on commerce and economic development, which is a wonderful place to land. It can be pretty disorienting going into the legislature. I think we all like to feel competent, and entering a new job where you don't really know anything and you're at the bottom of the totem pole and everyone else knows what's going on and they all know that you don't know what's going on. And you're in these beautiful surroundings in the state house. It's a lot like moving to Pownell, actually. You get to town and this place is phenomenal and I don't know anyone. And the last 2 months have been about building relationships, getting to know people. And to be frank, I'm quite fortunate to be in a committee that aligns with my professional background and ongoing activities with the BCRC, because some of the faces coming in to testify in the committee were familiar faces. So there was a little bit of a safe harbor there. I can imagine had I landed in a committee that was less familiar to me, it would have been another slate of new individuals whose names I needed to try to learn and remember. Commerce and economic development has a lot of, and I will get to this a little bit later, but it has a lot of interest in consumer protection. And that's informed a good bit of what our work has been in the first 2 months of the session leading up to crossover. Be happy to dive into that when it's appropriate. But I really have found that, working in the public sector, as the Bennington County Regional Commission is a political subdivision of the state of Vermont, has been aligned with my values. And what's most important to me is economic development in the public interest. And I see legislative work as an extension of that and an opportunity to engage on sort of the front end, the user end, and the sort of back end of our economic development sort of protocols. And that's something that we don't have all the control in the world over. But, if you think about a F1 Formula One race car, you don't win by a minute. You win by like a second after a 500-mile race. And so what we can do to reduce drag and push a little, get us a little bit faster, can mean all the difference. So I'm glad to have the opportunity to do that work in Montpelier and in Bennington and at home in Pownell.
Excellent, thank you. And I guess we'll hop to the other part of the county with Representative Durfee. Let us know a little bit about your district and your background that led you to serving in the legislature.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Good morning again, and thank you for organizing this. And sorry, I know the rest of us who are just making a first appearance are probably also disappointed that we haven't been able to get on the show up until now. It's been a pretty busy session, and maybe going forward will be regular visitors. So my district is, I live in Shaftesbury, and my district's maybe a little more straightforward. It's all of Shaftesbury and all of Glastonbury, which only has 9 people, but it's I always make sure that we get Glastonbury in there. And then in Sunderland, I have part of Sunderland, and I don't think I need to go into the details there. It's a little complicated, but I'm imagining there aren't as many Sunderland viewers. If anybody has a question, you can reach out and I'll let you know whether you're in my district or not. And I was first elected in 2018, so I've been serving in the legislature for about 6 years. I grew up just over the border in New York State and lived lots of different places. Got an MBA at one point and worked for a number of small-ish family-owned businesses doing analysis of one sort or another, and ended up back in Shaftesbury, or ended up back in this part of the world, and settled in Shaftesbury 25 years ago. And eventually was asked if I would serve on the school board. And I thought about that for a couple of years and then decided, yes, that sounded like something that might be a good way to serve the community. And that eventually led to, as it does for many folks, I think, thinking about, are there other things that I could do, and then running for the legislature. As a way of service, I've always felt that government can do good things, and if we want to have a strong democracy, we need to participate. I am also the elected treasurer for the Mount Anthony Union School District, having served on that school board in the past, and continued to do that work as well.
Excellent. And Representative Cooper, you mentioned a little bit about your committee and the work that it does. I'm going to go back through. So Representative Durfee, if you could let us know what committee you serve on in the House and a brief description of the work that committee undertakes.
Yeah, we each, the House members each serve on one committee, and we spend a lot of our time when we're in Montpelier in the committee and doing the real work of the legislature there. This term again, I was asked to chair the Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency, and Forestry, and it's all in the name there. We have been this session looking at all three of those areas and in one form or another, and spent quite a bit of time back in February taking testimony on the statewide universal school meals program that the state enacted originally 3 years ago, and then confirmed again 2 years ago. This year, the governor in his budget proposed repealing universal school meals to save a little bit of taxpayer money on property taxes. We gave that a thorough review and concluded unanimously in our committee that we didn't feel that was a good idea at all. And I'm happy to talk more about that later if there's time and if there's interest. I will say also that this past week, we worked and passed out a bill that Representative Cooper had introduced that deals with small food producers. And we're excited about that.
Very nice. And I'll pass it over to Representative Morrissey. If you could tell us a little bit about the committee that you serve on and a brief description of that committee's work as well.
Okay, this is my fourth term sitting on the Institutions and Corrections Committee. The Institutions Committee deals with putting a plan together and funding projects across the state that are state-owned, mostly state-owned projects, and that they are connected with the mission, also projects within our agency. What's interesting about our committee is when you think about institutions, I think you usually think about buildings and maintaining and all of that part of it. But we have a very broad section of issues that we deal with, such as, yes, we do have, the maintenance of our state buildings, and that's across the whole state. It's anything from, fixing roofs to maintenance, general maintenance, to any type of need in a building that the state owns. We also, especially with the corrections side of our committee, because it's called Institutions and Corrections, we also deal with obviously those buildings, and we also deal with, which when I first went into the committee, I was somewhat surprised, though, as I learned my first session, that the other areas that we deal with are, the state colleges, the University of Vermont, we provide funding for them, the Vermont Veterans Home. We also have a portion of our budget that provides funding for even little local projects. It's called the Building Communities Grants. So say you have either a nonprofit or a group within your community they can apply for a fairly easy application for funding. I believe it's up to $25,000, and they have to have matching funds for whatever their need is. That they can often get money towards a project. It really helps within our communities for these smaller little projects. That's been a very good, I think, project within our budget that we do. We also deal with, which I never realized would have been a part of it, but natural resources, and we deal with, the our parks infrastructure and rehabilitation, dam safety. We also public land infrastructure. We look to deal with clean water with the agency, natural resources, and a number of pieces which I won't go through it, but clean water and also water quality grants. But many of our communities across the state use. We have again, forest parks and recreation that we deal with. We deal with military, and within that section, they're looking at a southern site for a readiness center that would be somewhat like our, armory was here in Bennington, or still is, but they're looking to the next steps of that. We also deal with agriculture, the food and market, and such things as the Big E, that a number of, we have some local folks, Mike Nigro and his wife have participated in that project for the last couple of years, as well as our local village chocolate shop has been there. And so we have, in another state, because it's owned by Vermont, we need to maintain those buildings. But we also deal with public safety and their buildings, judiciary, the courts. Our budget is what we put into our budget is $127 million budget, which is mostly bonded. And 2 years ago, they started with a cash fund, which helps to pay for some projects a little bit more upfront, and so that it's not bonded money, which, as we all know, has some interest and other pieces attached to it. So this can also be a more wise way of spending our money and keeping it lower, a little bit lower in cost. But it is a very interesting committee because of all of the agencies that we deal with, but it can be complicated based upon scheduling these projects out, doing the schematic development of what these projects will look like, and scheduling and keeping them within budget, especially when we've had the last couple of years major flooding that has changed some of our priorities. So it can often be a moving target on some of these projects moving forward in the way they originally were planned. So I think I probably have gone too long, but it is a pretty broad committee. And then, of course, we deal with corrections and we work with some of the other committees, such as judiciary, on some of those issues.
I think the breadth of that description is probably helpful, and I hope it's helpful to viewers because I think the committee's name, Corrections and Institutions, kind of belies the breadth and complexity of the actual work that gets done there. And I know that's something that I've also heard Representative Greer talk about, as that is also his committee assignment. As we viewers of the show will know that Representative Corcoran serves on the Transportation Committee and has served on that committee for his time in the legislature. And then I'm going to pass it over to you, Senator Plunkett, because one of the big differences between the House and the Senate, we discussed a little bit on the previous episode, is that while House members serve on a single committee, the senators serve on multiple committees. So if you could talk a little bit about just how that looks a little different on the Senate side, but also with crossover coming, Representative Cooper mentioned the term crossover, what that actually means and how that work between the House and the Senate happens.
Sure. I'll start off with just in terms of the committees, and I'm most familiar with my committees, obviously. And looking at the folks here, my two committees deal with issues from three of the four representatives that are here. I don't believe we deal with any transportation, although who knows? We'll see. Agriculture is actually the most limited and fairly straightforward. It deals with anything that's agriculture. The Senate committee on that is actually more narrow than Representative Durfee's committee that deals with forestry as well. And food and markets, which I guess we do deal with in agriculture. And that one's fairly straightforward. I'm also in the institutions committee, which we just call it institutions instead of corrections and institutions. And this year it's changed scope to a great degree. So much of what Representative Morrissey had talked about was, well, some of it was in reference to what I'm learning is called the Capitol Bill, which touches on all of the different agencies in the state. And that starts on the House side and then comes over to the Senate side. So this gets me into crossover. What is this? It's it's essentially a self-imposed deadline that the legislature has made for itself, where a bill that originates on the Senate side it has to be voted out of committee to be presented to the floor by a certain date, and that date was yesterday. And the same is true on the House side, where it has to be voted out of the committee and then put on notice for the House floor. Now, the deadline yesterday was for what are called policy bills. And so anything that doesn't have to do with money, that doesn't come out of, and all of the committees are named differently. And the House has Ways and Means and Appropriations. The Senate has Finance and Appropriations. Those are the taxing and spending committees. One committee decides what the taxes are going to be. Essentially, there's a lot more to that, and the other committee decides how it's going to be spent. So those bills have to be passed out of those respective committees by the end of next week, so that they then can be put on notice on the floors of each chamber. And I guess there's a lot more that can go into, but that's essentially what that means. The Senate has to finish its the work that it starts there. House has to start works there, and it crosses over to the other chamber. And that's for this session for this year. It'll happen again next year of the different biennium. And so what we've done in our community, and I'll start with institutions, is what we don't have the Capitol bill yet, so we haven't delved deeply into that. We have not had any corrections bills referred to us from that have originated on the Senate side. So we're dealing with what's new is information technology, and we've passed out two bills. One of them that was passed by the floor. The other is going to the floor next week. Both of those are going to be going over to Representative Cooper's committee. They're essentially consumer protection bills. Even though it does deal with information technology, it does have that range. So what we heard from Representative Morrissey and what I've experienced here is that the interactions of all of these laws are incredibly great. It's a big spider web that goes from one issue to the next, and sometimes it's difficult to sort of navigate that to find out where things go. And that actually happened this year with one of our bills, which was the data privacy bill, where in the Senate it was first referred to the Economic Development Committee, which had traditionally dealt with consumer protection, and then it was removed and put into our committee, and that was a little more than a week ago. So that left us with a very, very short period of time to go over that bill, figure out if it's something that we want to push to the floor, and figure out if it's something that we want the House to take up as well. And that's what I've experienced with this crossover week, is that everything that had been leading up to this was relatively slow, and then it was moved very, very fast to a degree that it was actually uncomfortable for me to be able to make these decisions on such crucial issues. And I was lucky. I had essentially one bill in one committee and sort of two in the other committee. And so it's a sort of grueling week that we just got over with, and I think that might be why a lot of us weren't necessarily expecting to be on today, and then popped on when our when our calendars showed. But I hope that answered your question in terms of the interplay of things, and at least what my experience with crossover would be. I think Representative Durfee and Representative Corcoran might have different take on it, and because they clearly have dealt with it many, many times. But that's my take on what's happened in this crucial last week.
Yeah, I would love to hear your take on it, Representative Corcoran, and also a little bit of a chance to talk about what's going on in the transportation world as you came up to that crossover.
Sure. Really not much to add. Senator Plunkett was spot on. We have these self-imposed deadlines, and that's in order to give the other body due time to do their work, and so we can be out in a reasonable time. I don't know if it's going to play out like that this year with all the other factors that are going on, but yeah, no, he did a great job explaining that. And again, for those who don't know me, I serve on the transportation committee, and typically we just deal with two bills. We have our the transportation budget, and then while we're working on that, the Senate is dealing with the DMV miscellaneous bill, and so we sort of crisscross those. We have until next week to get our budget passed out, which we will do, and the Senate will have next week to get their DMV miscellaneous bill passed out. So we switch work, but this year it's I guess I'll back up. Around 20 years ago, we implemented a prioritization list of how projects get in the book. So it's more scientific, it's fact-based, it's input from the towns, and then just looking at what needs to be done. Before that, it was a little bit of the wild, wild west. It was just like if you were on the committee, you were like, hey, what about my project? And and that wasn't the most fair thing to do. So it's more fine-tuned. So when we get the the so-called the white book is where all the projects are, there's rarely do we mess with that. What the governor presents is typically what gets approved. There's exceptions to the rules. If things get delayed or a project's canceled, we'll move money around. So we don't typically delve in that too much. And the rest of it is policy pieces. This year the policies were relatively minor. Some of the bigger policy pieces pertained around the rail trails that we have. Lamoille Valley just got constructing, I don't know, it was like 100+ miles of, rail trail. That's a rail that was rail bank, so they could turn it into, rail trails. And so we had a policy piece about sort of like the do's and don'ts, what somebody can do on there. Obviously, no loitering, no camping, no hunting on, within the right of way. So we just, that was one of the policy pieces that we dealt with. And another big one was the public transit. The public transit in the state of Vermont, needs to be fine tuned. There's the outlook is not great financially, especially up in the Chittenden County. That's considered the urban provider, GMT, and they're looking at a $3 to $5 million deficit, next year, and it's going to compound after that. So obviously something needs to be done to sort of right that ship. And we did paid for a study to be done, and that was handed in beginning of this year. And basically what the bulk of it, with the recommendation, was to sort of realign the routes, to sort of saying, GMT, the routes that you're providing in the rural areas, maybe you got to let go of those and realign and refocus on the routes that you provide, the services that you provide. So in a nutshell, they sort of severed off quite a few routes in the rural areas that they'll no longer be responsible um, for providing. And um, so it's going to be more efficient, and hopefully there's going to be cost savings there. Basically $3 to $5 million. So we think that's going to right the ship. So we put language in there to allow that to move forward, and the wheels are going to be in motion over the next year to accomplish that. And the next big thing is, like I said, we typically don't delve into the white book, but with all the flooding and the devastation to the towns, you're like, obviously, how can we, help the towns? It's really hard to move money around because projects are, you have funding matches. Typically your project is an 80-20 match, 80% federal, 20% state. So it's to take state, you're leaving 80% of federal dollars on the table. So you got to find a program or an area where it's typically 100% state dollars, so you can move it, and that's typically the maintenance budget. In the years past, the maintenance budgets, in our opinion, has had the flexibility to maybe take a haircut a little bit, and so we always went to that to um, you know go get a couple million, 2 or 3 million, and give it to the towns. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case this year. We've the cupboards are bare, so to say. Transportation outlook as a whole is not great. It's not great at all. Our gas consumption is way down, which is good. But again, when we rely on that as a funding source to fund our roads and bridges, we need to replace that. So that's a big problem when you're down roughly 50 million gallons over the last 10 years or so. How do you make that up? And so sort of scattered here with my thoughts, but so how do you make that up? And we look, obviously what's causing, the less, the gas revenue to go down, and there's a lot of factors, but one of them is the EVs. The EVs are becoming more and more prevalent. We're getting close to 15% of sales, within a year. So I mean that adds up, and so one of our big things over the prior year was to set up the thing called MBUF, miles based user fee. it's miles traveled on an electric vehicle. And we had that teed up because we received a federal grant from the feds of roughly $3 million. We found out about a month ago that the Trump administration took that back, and they took roughly $20+ million of EV charging money away from us. So now we're trying to scramble and say, all right, how do we make up that $3 million? To front our roadway. So we're looking for different avenues to, and we haven't buttoned this up yet, is where to go to get this, $3 million. Because like I said, our revenues are declining. We need to have some more stability, or else, towns are going to suffer. That's where I was sort of leading, is that it's hard to give money to towns at this particular time, but the thing that we did is, we can control policy. So we put in an index on the class 2 in the town highway structures, like we did for town highway 8 years ago. So it's based on the CPI, on the transportation's budget from the year before. So if that goes up, those two programs will go up modestly. We're not talking a lot of money, but over time it compounds, and it goes up. But just for an example, like I said, we have the CPI in effect for the town highway 8. That went up 3%. So within that program, that went in up $860,000 this year, which is, like I said, it's when you spread that out amongst the town, it's probably not that much, but and the totality, 5 years, 10 years, it builds up, and that's a manageable thing. So, that's unfortunately the only thing that we could do is, to help the town, was put an index on those two programs. And, the short term is nothing great, but in the long term, you're gonna, see more and more money into those programs. So yeah, that's, like I said, that was, like the main focus is how do you, recoup the declining revenues. It was going to be miles based. We had to re-scramble on that, readjust. So that's probably going to get pushed out a couple years. And in the meantime, I know I said this last time when I was on the show, people were upset with the EV infrastructure fee that we put on vehicles, which was $84. They were quite surprised in January that they had this new bill. And again, that's when you have declining revenues, you have to make up for it. And that was one of the ways that we did it. But that was supposed to go away this year and be replaced by this miles base. But unfortunately, that is not going to happen. So it's going to be at least a year or two before we can get back on track with the miles base. So in a nutshell, like I said, that was our main focus. This is, like I said, in my 23 years, this is probably one of the smaller bills that we've had as far as policy wise. Money wise, it's, like I said, it's quite substantial. It's $883 million that we have in this program, which is roughly a 4.8% increase. But again, it's there were still tough decisions as far as how to spread that money out. For example, our paving. Typically we back in our heyday, we were paving close to 300 miles a year. This year, the paving budget is down to 102 million, and that probably going to get you 120 to 125 million. So obviously you can see the gap, and we're not keeping up with what we should be doing, because the data tells us we should be repaving a road every 10 years. And in order to do that, you need to pave 300, I think 25 miles a year. Obviously the math tells you we're not keeping up with that. So, so those are major issues that, we're trying to, deal with, is how to make, the transportation sustainable, moving forward, so we don't have a deteriorating, hopefully with a miles based and, not this year, but down the road, we're gonna have to think of replacing declining revenue with revenue that's at least sustainable or has an upside. And one of those is, like I said, I don't think it's not gonna happen this year, but is a delivery fee. When you get a go online and you get a package delivered to you, they might be a fee. And we think that's somewhat reasonable. You think of the roads, the heavy trucks that deliver those packages do quite a, bit of damage. That might be a way to go. Again, it's not happening this year, might not happen next year, but you have to sort of think outside the box of creating new revenue, because our three main sources, aren't the best suited in today's world to fund our infrastructure. So guess I'll leave it at that.
I think that makes sense. And touching on that uncertainty around funding generally, but specifically the mention you made of uncertainty around federal funding, I think some of the biggest news that came out of the legislature and the state government in the last week was the governor's veto of the mid-year budget adjustment. And his two stated rationales were, number one, uncertainty around federal funding and his desire to preserve state budgets and to possibly hold off any proposed increases or changes until the FY26 budget, just until the federal landscape becomes a little clearer. And then also his second rationale was specifically his desire not to expand the hotel motel voucher program, mentioning, and I'll just read what was in the governor's message in point 2. Expanding the free hotel motel program moves us backwards, reversing important progress made towards reforming this failed program, agreed upon by the administration and the legislature just last year. After nearly 5 years of experience, we know this approach is far too expensive and fails our constituents, communities, and taxpayers. And so in lieu of the $1.8 million proposed budget adjustment, the administration put forward a different $2.1 million plan that would give money directly to towns and communities through grants. And I'm just interested for sort of a Bennington perspective and a legislature temperature check on this veto. And I guess I'll start with you, Representative Durfee.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I'll say the governor made it clear that he wasn't happy with that very small but meaningful change that the House made in its version that the Senate kept. I'm not quite sure I follow his logic that federal and uncertainty means that we need to save, I think it's maybe 14 or $15 million that was not in his plan. We've got billions of dollars that come in from the federal government. And if we continue to lose programs, Representative Tim mentioned, Representative Corcoran, how we've already lost money that a previous Congress appropriated legally, and it's now being withheld illegally, in my opinion. A few $1 million here and there isn't going to really help in the long run. The federal government decides that no rules apply anymore, that the rule of law doesn't apply anymore. So yeah, I don't quite understand why the governor would veto a bill that has millions of dollars for the veterans home in it. It's a $250 million bill, and to be quibbling over 1.8 million for the motel program, which I think calling it a failed program is not inaccurate. It has not been a successful program. But the legislature has charged the administration with coming up with an alternative, and they haven't. So here we are.
And Representative Cooper, I think sort of along those lines, what would you see as the path forward from this veto?
So, well, I think that we'll sort of regroup. I know how much effort appropriations had sort of put into getting us to the Budget Adjustment Act. And it is important to underscore that the alternative is posited as a $2.1 million program, a more expensive program that will rely on municipalities to volunteer. And I cannot imagine that there will be a lot of takers for that municipal approach. So I do want to make sure that I highlight that's not really a workable choice. And to propose an alternative that is meaningless is not really proposing an alternative. And in my humble opinion, is not genuine leadership. Being a brand new legislator, I probably should learn to not say things like that. But I also don't really know what happens when a budget adjustment act is vetoed. Where do we go from here? House leadership has been really communicative with us freshman Democrats around these processes. But with the amount of work that was on my plates in the last 3 days, I wasn't able to absorb as much of that as I think would be helpful. So I'd be happy to hear from from longer tenured representatives like Tim and Mary, who probably have been around for a budget adjustment act veto or two. But whatever the work is that's required of us, we'll certainly be ready to do it.
And I think Representative Morrissey, I'll turn to you for some insights on how things move forward from a vetoed budget adjustment. And then also, as someone who I know has brought similar concerns about the motel voucher program forward, how you're thinking about what reforms to that program or alternatives to that program could look like, or what you're hearing from constituents.
Well, again, I have heard a great deal from constituents that, certainly do want to have programs to help our most vulnerable, and definitely, the state has over the years has put, programs into place. Many of the concerns, I think, with the voucher program, and for me to a degree, was that during the time of implementation, and I know it was during COVID, I wasn't seeing the oversight. And not that you don't want to help people, but quite honestly, there were many out-of-state cars that were in our motel and hotel parking lots that our state dollars were going towards to help. And again, we're a state that looks to help folks, but we do need to help our own folks first. The amount of money that has been put in to the voucher program, and without having it in front of me, and I don't want to misquote, I think has been over $200 and some million, and we don't have anything to quite honestly show for it. We do, in the sense that we helped folks during a period of time, but you've also noticed that many of the motels and hotels, and I could point out a number of them here in Bennington, that have had to basically rehab their motels and hotels since this program was. I would myself have, or would want us to have spent, $200 and some million is quite a bit of money that we could have probably or possibly had some permanent housing going forward for the folks in need of help during difficult times. And I think all of us here want to do the right thing to help the most vulnerable, but sometimes just continuing with programs that are costing a great deal and really not solving the problem. I would like to see us in a better place with the housing that actually is there to help and provide for our most vulnerable. And going forward, with a budget adjustment, that's now being vetoed, we do have an opportunity to make Okay, well, let me back up for 1 second. Usually a budget adjustment in all the years, and it seems as though in the recent number of years, more policy has been put on to the budget adjustment. Budget adjustment in its original form was kind of to have a midterm look at where some agencies might need more funding because of certain things that happened within their budget. So they need more money to truly fund what the actual needs were across the state in some programs. Each year we have found, or I have seen, a little bit of the increase of policy. Policy is usually left for committee legislation, or it's left to be put into the budget, such as, Tim was explaining and others speaking this morning, that language is put in. I know, like, our capital bill has quite a bit of language that basically tells the parameters of what you can work around in that. So it's not just this broad, open funding and possibly unrealistic way of going forward. So we do have an opportunity within the budget, which will be coming out. And yes, I know there's great concern with what is presently going on in Washington with a great deal of uncertainty that adds to this whole picture. So I think we do have an opportunity, and for freshmen, it may seem right now that there's not, and sometimes there isn't, but I do believe we can get through other pieces of legislation that might have come to crossover yesterday, as well as the budget, that we do have some opportunities. And maybe I'm being unrealistic, but I'm trying to be realistic that we all work together to move forward with, the priorities of what the needs are of the state. And again, wanting to help folks certainly in vulnerable positions, but I'm not sure if this is always the best means where we've spent as much money as we have on it.
I appreciate that context as well in terms of how you have seen budget adjustments change over time. I want to just, we'll wrap up in just a second because we're almost at time, but I do want to check back in with Representative Cooper as a freshman. Just a general sort of vibe check on your experience coming into the legislature at this time, when there have been so many new people on both sides of the aisle, but also when there has been a dynamic shift between the representation.
I certainly have had an interesting onboarding experience from the election on. I will say that I think that that shift in representation has been a really, I think, good thing. It feels like people are, a lot of the incoming legislators have spent a lot of time socializing, not as members of parties, but as newcomers, sort of that class of 2024, we might say. And in the legislation that Representative Durfee mentioned, that I'd sponsored, there were 32 co-sponsors for H401 from independents, Republicans, Democrats. It was just looking at these ideas. What do we think? And I've had the opportunity to support legislation from members of the House from all over the state and across the political spectrum, where there have been, I think, good ideas. And with as much turnover as we had in the 24 election and also in the 22 election, there's not as many longer tenured representatives, which means that where a lot of us are turning to them to help us understand what this process is. I had to inquire about a token session because I need to present a bill on the floor next week, and there was some concern that the calendar might move quickly if there were, and so someone else can explain what a token session is. Fortunately, there will not be one on Monday, so I have a little more time. But that sort of spirit, I think, of support and of having a shared responsibility is one that exists across the floor, and it's nice to be around it. And I think that a lot of people who were there last term and recall the supermajority do so with a little bit of where it's not a warm memory. That's not an easy way to feel like you're on a team, or that you're all rowing in the same direction. Even if you have different priorities, that sort of overrepresentation feels like it doesn't represent the public, and it can feel a little sticky and gummy. And I think that's not great for morale. And I'm glad to say that that's a little different this time around, at least from my perspective.
Thank you very much for that perspective as someone coming into this experience. Representatives Corcoran, Morrissey, Durfee, and Cooper, thank you so much. Same for you as well, Senator Plunkett. I look forward to many more of these conversations and having you on future episodes of the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jack.
Thanks, everybody.
Have
Take care, all.
a good rest of the weekend.